Hello and welcome to Cybersecurity TV from our studios here near Washington, D.C. for this special presentation sponsored by Cybersecurity TV and NeoSystems. It is what is the second in the series of What is the Future of Government Cybersecurity Risk and Supply Chains, Part 2. With us today, we have our moderator, David Berteau, President and CEO of the Professional Services Council, Katie Arrington, CISO for the Assistant Secretary of Defense Acquisition Department of Defense, Mark Montgomery, who is the Executive Director of the Solarium Commission, Bob Kolaski, Assistant Director of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, Ed Bassett, Chief Information Security Officer for NeoSystems, Chris Nissen, who's Director of the Asymmetric Threat Response and Supply Chain Security, MITRE Corporation, and co-author of Delivered Uncompromised, and Eric Crucius, partner with Holland and Knight. There are question links to the left of underneath the player to submit your questions. As soon as you have them, send them in. And also there's a tech support link on the other side if you have any tech issues. Our tech support team is standing by to help you. There are also 2 reference links on the website, Deliver Uncompromised report that Chris Nissen wrote, and the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission report. So now without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David Berteau. David?
Thank you, Dave, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We have assembled the same panel that we had back at the beginning of June when we started this process on the future of government cybersecurity, risk, and the supply chain. This is part 2. I want to alert our folks we're going to be going through in order of the discussions here. Mark, I'll be calling on you first, but I have a few more comments before I do that. Dave Gardy was kind enough to introduce you all, so I'm not going to duplicate that introduction. Let me just reflect a little bit. When we had the first part of this series of this panel, it was early June. We had some idea of what we thought was going to be happening over the next couple of months. And I think some of us even had the idea that by the time we got to the end of July, we might be doing this panel in person and live. But it turns out that has not materialized, right? And so I think that the continued ability for NeoSystems and Cybersecurity TV to be able to allow this kind of panel to assemble itself and to present to you and answer your questions is really a profound indication of how much has changed and how good some of that change is in terms of being able to reach people across the country and around the world. I think a couple of things that are worth noting here. The threat, the cybersecurity threat that we face, not only in DoD or even just in the federal government, but across the nation and around the world, is also continuing to grow. In fact, if anything, I think the dynamics of COVID-19 have provided both increased opportunities for and increased value from some of those cyber threats. It's not just about tech data, it's actually an awful lot across the spectrum in terms of disruption and countervailing attitudes. I think in addition, the dynamic in the Congress is that back in June, there was even some talk about whether another response and recovery bill was even needed. Now we're in the final throes of negotiations over what's going to be in that bill. There are some deadlines as early as tomorrow, so there's some urgency with respect to congressional action here. But I think, again, it illustrates a couple of things. One is the significant uncertainty that we face, not only because of COVID-19, but because of a lot of other dynamics, the overall economy, the global impact, and the continually evolving threat. I think in addition, it indicates the need for even greater vigilance and even greater activity on the part of both the agencies represented here today and those who represent the point of view of analysis that involves both companies and other institutions in the cybersecurity threat arena and the response arena. So I'm going to call on each of you to provide some updates in terms of what's happened. Mark, in your case, with respect to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and its recommendations and where implementation stands and what you see as the hope for the future. Katie, in your case, where DoD is and where they're going. Bob Kolaski, in your case, what's happened at CISA, not just from a DHS CISA point of view, obviously, but from your responsibilities government-wide in that regard. Then we'll turn to Ed Bassett, who will cover kind of what it looks like to the people on the receiving end of all this stuff who actually have to implement it day to day in their companies. Chris will then capture for us the underpinnings from the strategic analysis framework that goes all the way back to before Deliver Uncompromised was put into place. And then, as always, we let our lawyers have the last word. Eric Crucius will wrap up. What does it really mean for the companies and your clients there? Type your questions as you go. We're going to try to leave as much time as we can for questions. Last time we had a number of unanswered questions. They tended to focus a lot on not so much why we were doing what we were doing, but what was going to happen and when it was going to happen and how you had to be ready for that. And I think we'll cover much of that as we go forward here today. So with that, I'll terminate my introduction. I want to thank NeoSystems and Cybersecurity TV for allowing PSC to moderate this panel, and I want to thank all the panel members for being here. At least I'm going to thank you before we start. We'll see if I still thank you at the end when we finish here. So, Mark, let me turn over to you. The commission report's been out for a while now, and you've been very active in terms of execution and implementation. Can you give us an update on what it means and where it's going? Thanks.
Hey, sure. Thanks, David, and thanks to NeoSystems and Cybersecurity TV for hosting this, and to my other 5 panelists. It's great to see you all here again. Yeah, it's been a busy few weeks. We I've gone through both NDAA floor amendment cycles. So what I tell you is we had about 50 legislative proposals. About 10 of them were like break glass ones, like after there's been a major incident and you realize you should have taken cybersecurity more seriously, here's what you should do. We have a few of those, including one to reorganize the congressional committees, which obviously will not happen without a significant incident occurring. Then we had about 40 that we worked on to try to get into various stages of the NDA. About 30 are in different parts. That doesn't mean we'll get 30 out. We have, let's say a third of those are in both the House and the Senate. A third of them are in the House only, and a third of them are in the Senate only. It's possible we'll end up with 0 recommendations in the NDA. I don't think so, but we're aiming for about 15, which would be a good healthy first whack at it. A little more, a little less would be okay. I wouldn't expect too much more than 15, but we'll see what happens. There are 3 broad areas there's 2 areas where we're really in, and there's one that I want to mention at the end that I wish we could have done more. The first is in our military improvements to military cyber. Now, let's be clear. The SASC and the HASC have done a very good job with DoD and DNI, along with the CISO and HIPC over the last 5 years. Key changes have gone in. If you think about cyber surveillance, reconnaissance, and traditional military activity, setting up the PCA, CMMC, there's all kinds of strong legislative support for what the department's doing. But I think most of us, as we step back, realize that we would be a misshapen blob if we only had DoD and the DNI right and everybody else was struggling. So we were looking to mostly do work in other areas, but we did have about 10 recommendations for the military, for the department. And most of them are, I think 9 are in both bills, or 8 are in both bills, and 2 are in just the Senate bill. And hopefully we'll get all of these through. But it has to do with the force structure assessment of CMF, analyzing different ways of setting up a cyber reserve force, clarifying the capabilities and utility of the National Guard cyber elements, vulnerability assessments of the DIB and threat information sharing with the DIB, and then vulnerability analysis of our NC3 network. So hopefully those will all come together in the final bill. The second big group was U.S. government reform. That gets most of the attention. We have a hearing in about 3 hours at 1300 today with the House Armed Services Committee, and a hearing on the 4th of August. NCD will be a big part of both, particularly the Senate one. And that's the National Cyber Director. We're still pushing very hard on that. We're more convinced than ever that one of the principal lessons learned from the COVID crisis is that non-traditional national security emergencies require pre-planning at a strategic level, led from the White House, and having the proper incident response team on scene with the relationships with the private sector, with the interagency. We think the NCD is what makes CISA really effect. We think the NCD is an amplifier for CISA and will really help CISA perform its mission. We definitely took a look at establishing an independent cyber department. Realized that would be too hard, and in the absence of that, we felt CISA really needed this strategic support at the White House. Also, continuity of the economy is in one of the bills. We think that's critical to be doing the planning for how you recover the economy, much like COOP and COG. We think that's overdue, and I think it's hard for the federal government. I think the real skill set for doing that probably sits, all the operational planners probably sit in DoD, but the responsibility sits at CISA, at the DHS, CISA, and the other sector-specific agencies. So we get there's some guidance from there, to put DHS in charge of this, CISA specifically, and then let them do their national risk management responsibility and continuity of the economy planning. And there's a joint cyber planning office that we recommend that's in the bill right now to be put at CISA to kind of help support that COAT, but also support the national cyber director in his any defensive cyber campaign planning he might direct. And I think our biggest success so far is we have about 4 different provisions that strengthen CISA. It's about doing an appropriate force structure assessment of CISAs that have the right troop to task ratios, making sure GAO is looking, giving them a fair shake on what kind of spaces they need, what kind of infrastructure they need for the NKIC, for their integrated cyber center to be effective. Discussing the critical kind of first among equals role of the ICC among the federal cyber centers, the Joint Cyber Planning Office I mentioned, and even some discussions of national risk management and how kind of the first among equals they are there as you bring in your sector risk management into the NRMC to do the overall prioritization. And then there's some administrative things. What's the rank and pay structure of the CISA director, and whether or not it should be a term limit. The one thing, so the military stuff's in there. I think I'm pretty comfortable with a lot of it, but you never know. You can end up with none of it, but I think we'll do pretty well there. The U.S. government reform, is going to be how well our legislative commissioners, our 4 legislative commissioners, do in selling these processes inside the conference that happens at the end of August. And then I think the third area that I wish we'd been able to do more on is ecosystem, but I think there's opportunities for further bills and legislation to work on those. That's the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, a national certification and labeling authority. I think we're going to have another bite at the apple, at least 2 of them over the next 8 months to work those. The one I definitely want to mention is a strategy for ICT, basically an industrial policy for information communications technology. What the NDAA has right now is 3 or 4 lines of effort for this. There's a protect bill in there about microchips. There's an American Foundries Act. There's ORAN, 5G and ORAN. There's a ton of bills and a lot of money buried in the potentially in the NDAA. Whether or not it gets out of in the final bill, I'm not sure. Those are all kind of lines of effort of having an ICT strategy, but we don't actually have an ICT strategy. So we asked that the executive branch produce that and say, hey, this is how we create a secure, stable supply chain for IT hardware and software, and here are the lines of effort to get at that. In the absence of a strategy, we're building lines of efforts. Most planners will tell you that's bass backwards. You really need to have the strategy, then the implementing elements, then and then you're likely to achieve success. So we're really pushing hard to get that ICT strategy out there so that we can tackle. We can hang these lines of effort on it and have an integrated strategy. And that'd be, I think, the private sector will trust that a lot more if they can see what the final goal is. It's easier to understand the individual elements that we're doing to get at it. So across those 3 things, we're making progress. Like I said, the most in the military, then U.S. government reform, and then third, the ecosystem. But we do have a couple more bites at the apple over the next 6 months, and I'm excited to work them. What I'd say now is that the conference starts August 17th. Takes about 2 to 3 weeks. We'll know a lot more in the beginning of September about how healthy we are in the NDAA, and it could be a high number, it could be a low number, but we'll be working hard. That's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That's a good, quick summary, and I think it sets the stage very nicely. Much of the folks who work on Capitol Hill believe that once they've passed legislation, the job is done, and then they move on to the next round of legislation, right? We've seen that over time. But of course, there are people on the receiving end of that legislation who have to deal with it, both current legislation and also prior year legislation. So what I want to turn to next are the 2 agencies that are front and center, both on this panel and in the larger realm of doing business with the government and protecting America. And that is first Katie Arrington from DoD. So what's going on, Katie? What has changed since this panel was last together in early June? And what are you doing? What are you seeing? What are you planning? Over to you. Thanks.
It's ever evolving. As Mark just went through, all that's going on the NDAA has been a lot. We are still trucking right along with the DFAR rule change for the CMMC. That is not deviated off of course. We have completed the interagency coordination and adjudication of the comments that I'm aware of, and that we're just waiting for the public comment period to come out on the Federal Registry. The training sessions are due to begin August 10th of the auditors through the accreditation body. They open the registration, I think, a few weeks after our first meeting in June. They've had a tremendous amount of response. So we're moving through on those. The AB is rocking and rolling. And as far as what we're doing in the department, the GSA putting it in there was a big deal, right? It was kind of saying this is a 10-year GWAC, and it's going to be a part of our world. Looking at being more aggressive on the pilots has been one of the focal points to really get them rolling. The sooner the better, but changing a little bit of the trajectory, instead of focusing on level 3 and above, making sure that we have the right amount of assessors to be able to handle the level 1 load, right? Because there are about 270,000 companies that are going to need that. So reprioritizing, making sure that we've got the right teams coming out at the right time. The Pathfinders have been going incredibly well. Those have been amazing. I think we're on the 4th Pathfinder exercise and rolling it out. So a lot's been going on. I think everybody really needs to pay attention to what goes on the NDAA. I really think everybody should be very, very concerned and taking, and David, I'll give you this. You have been one of the leaders in this discussion. 889B, I cannot express to you enough how relevant that is to every single person on this webinar today about the ability, if you have a contract that's going to be awarded after August 13th, your company has to attest that your network is free of Huawei, Hikvision, ZTE product. This is a big one. I mean, a lot of what we're discussing is things that are going to happen, in a year or 6 months. This is something that's happening to your companies in literally a matter of days. So more that I think has a lot of impact about what's going to be happening with our community in the very near future. And I know David, you have really been you and all the tri associations have really been a leader on trying to get the awareness campaign out to industry about how impactful this can be. We cannot award work unless you can attest.
Right, Katie, and the challenge is not so much just the certification that you have no prohibited products. It's really a question of what do you do if you find out you do.
And really getting, for Mark and for, Bob and Chris, I mean, all of us, Ed, Eric, we've all been saying, listen, our supply chain's vulnerable. We've got to get on this. And, it's I have to give credit to the administration and to the Congress. This is not an easy decision to make. But if we don't start somewhere, it's like with the CMMC, if we keep kicking the can down the road, we're never going to get to where we got to go. And I've been saying it a lot lately. If you've done what you did, you're going to get what you got. What we have is a problem. And, it's got to take these big cultural steps to say, this is how we're going to make the reform we need. And 889B is the start. I think that as companies look, all of this effort, everything that Mark did with the Solarium, everything that Bob, Chris, and Brian are doing over at CISA, what you, David, and the tri associations have been doing, Chris has been doing it, delivered Uncompromised. We've all been trying to say everything has been about buying down the risk. And what can we do to buy down the risk on the supply chain to ensure national security, which is a monumental task, but also to ensure that your company is there in the long run, right? And the rubber has met the road, and it's 889B coming in, CMMC, the changes with CISA, the things that are in the NDAA that are going to directly affect companies about weapon systems, how we look at them, how we prioritize them, it's impactful. I don't think the world could be changing any faster than it is, and yet every day it changes faster. So make sure you're doing your best, people, every day. They're not letting up on the pedal.
Thank you, Katie. And our first two speakers have already generated a number of questions coming in. But before we get to those questions, let's round out the presentations from the rest of the panel. Bob, one of the things that you've got responsibility for at CISA is defending everything that's critical. Increasingly, we're seeing that the list of things that are not critical is getting shorter and shorter, and the list of things that are critical is getting longer and longer. In fact, I have a hard time determining now what is no longer critical, either in terms of infrastructure or in terms of workforce. And so you've been central to this process as we've evolved our responses to COVID-19. And in particular, as the government has had to wrestle with the question of how do I keep doing my day job while also responding to all of the emergencies generated by the pandemic, right? And this is true in DoD and it's true in all the agencies. So bring us up to date on where CISA is and what you've been doing lately. Over to you.
You're on mute.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Katie. First of all, after going after Katie, I always feel the urge to just give an amen right here. So amen to what Katie said at the end about world changing. And thanks, David, for having me. I wasn't able to participate in the first version of this, but glad to join the conversation. First of all, let me just sort of respond to your critical comment. I'm not sure that there are that the more things that are critical, there are more things that are connected. Right, and so that means that there are more things, that there's more ways to get at what is truly critical. And I do want to keep in mind that we have to have the ability to separate the things that really matter to us as a country, and that need the major investment, and then prioritize around that. And we will continue to define through the work we've done in national critical functions, stuff that's really important to the country. But you're absolutely right to point out that through those functions, they're all very connected, which creates a range of ways that adversaries can cause harm for us. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about critical. On top of what Mark said, I would like to thank Mark and the Solarium Commission for the great work that they did over the last couple of years, and some of what we see in the legislative process at this point we're excited about. There's obviously nuance there, and there will be things along the way, as laws get passed, and some of this becomes a reality, how we're going to implement. But I do think that he's absolutely right that what the Solarium Commission is doing is going to help us at CISA achieve our strategic risk management mission. And so we look forward to seeing the Congress take some action in those areas. So shifting a little bit to kind of an update since the last time you all got together. I mean, as a starting point, I think what we've seen in the last few weeks, unfortunately, has been a number of incidents, cyber incidents that just continue, the pace, the actions of our adversaries, the vulnerabilities and the scalability of the vulnerabilities that are being taken advantage of. Each week we learn about new things. So it creates an urgency to our mission. We've had a number of incidents over the last few weeks with high CVSS scores that need. And what a high CVS score, what a high vulnerability score means is the network defenders out there, the CISOs out there, the shops need to take action quickly and need to be prepared as these things are identified. It's a good thing that they're identified, that they're addressed and mitigated immediately. And so, the work of the CISO has never been more important and never been more urgent. Other things, the other things we're sort of seeing in the threat environment, a lot of this is reported in open source, which is sort of energizing where we're focusing our attention. China, Russia, thinking about ways that they might impede our recovery from COVID, whether it's related to issues around the vaccine, intellectual property, vaccine providers, using that, whether it's related to spreading misinformation. We have to be clear to our adversaries that in this moment where the country needs to put its whole focus on recovery from the pandemic, it is not acceptable to do anything in cyberspace or any other way to get in the way of our recovery. And that's a core message that the government has to be able to deliver. At CISO, we have to be backstopping and preparing to backstop, working with industry and our interagency partners, anything that we can do to keep critical things secure. And there's nothing more critical right now than the work that's going on to develop a vaccine to COVID and have the ability to push out that vaccine at scale so that all of us, hopefully at some point can get what we need from a public health perspective. So, a lot of energy there, a lot of interagency collaboration. We've signed a number of new partnerships with big healthcare companies to work together, the government and industry, to provide what's necessary in terms of intelligence and cybersecurity information sharing, cybersecurity tools, to really prioritize something that's become, crown jewel of activity for us in the U.S. There's a range of other things that become more important in a COVID environment or where we are right now, and making sure that government systems are protected, that school systems are protected, as we go into the 2020 election, that everything we can do to secure the 2020 election. And so I think our priorities from a criticality perspective are around healthcare and elections and doing what we can to maintain essential communications networks to let things happen virtually right now. To address those priorities, you're seeing a lot of action from us around where we do already have authorities. One is pushing out sort of direction, directives, and guidance to our federal colleagues to patch their networks, to secure against vulnerabilities, to do things differently in the face of some of the new vulnerabilities and threats that have emerged. And so we continue to actively engage with the federal CIO community to have a period of enhanced cybersecurity in the face of the environment. Similarly, but without as many authorities, we're pushing out a range of risk advice to the critical infrastructure community, starting with updating our cyber essentials, which we did last week, which is just a sort of simple playbook in good cybersecurity practices that we want to continue to push broadly, but then more technical guidance that's intended for use by the network defender community and folks who are making technical shifts in this work environment. So a lot of products related to remote work and telework. We've seen continued proliferation of ICS and OT attacks, and working through how that might transfer over to impacting functions. We recently released an industrial control systems strategy that we worked on with the interagency, really, and then we have some technical guidance below that to help secure industrial control systems as well. So I don't think I've ever seen us release as many products, whether they're guidance or whether they're particular risk products that are being pushed out there, both to the federal community and to the critical infrastructure community. And I think that's a dual sign. One, it's a sign, there's three things going on. One, it's a sign that, again, it's just where we are with the risk environment, and almost daily action is needed to secure networks, and we want to push out things. Two, I think we're maturing as an organization and have the ability to more quickly get things out. And three, I think there's a real commitment across the interagency to work together, to collaborate, to push things out so that there's sort of a unified government message on these issues. So I hope we're being responsive, but we're going to have to continue to be vigilant. I'll end with just, it's not all bad news, right? There are opportunities here as we come out of the pandemic, as we hopefully come out of the pandemic in the next 6 to 12 months, to take advantage of some lessons learned. We just established a working group of our information communications technology supply chain risk management task force, looking at how industry and government can perhaps build more resilience into ICT supply chains, so that it's more reliable, that there's probably less reliance on untrusted entities, there's less reliance on things in Asia where we can't really be confident that they might be available, and how do you build in security as you go through that. So I look forward to those task force recommendations, which we will have coming out in October. Another opportunity is sort of an international partnerships lens, and we spent a lot of time with our European colleagues right now. I think we're all seeing the benefits of an international collaboration on cyber and supply chain incidents, and also sort of the like-minded country meet. And we have to be a globe of like-minded countries who are working collaboratively against our adversaries, particularly against some of what China and Russia are doing. We're expanding our sort of collaboration with Asia, some of the Asian countries right now, Singapore, India, Japan, Korea, et cetera, because again, the sort of China threat sits over on top of a lot of this. So there's opportunities there. We'll continue to build out the work on the federal network side. The Federal Acquisition Security Council's made a good amount of progress in the last few months. And within CISO, we're starting to be able to make the investment in the kind of analysis we need to help industry and government understand supply chain risk. We're on the cusp of the National Risk Management Center of a pretty significant procurement for us in that area, and we're going to continue to build out our analytic capabilities. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. That was a very quick tour and a lot of material in there. And I think that among the highlights, and we're seeing questions coming in on this already, is CISO is doing a lot in terms of public-private collaboration and cooperation, which is clearly essential to your success. DoD has a structure in place that by using its own contracts, you're gonna create your own universe inside there. But obviously, you care beyond that universe. You're focusing primarily on the contractors and subcontractors that deliver to DoD. Bob, you've got a job that extends well beyond that universe into the broader private sector, and I think we'll touch on that a little bit in the question and answers. So now you've heard, from at the front end, from the Commission, from DoD, and from DHS in terms of what's going on and how it's going to impact you. Now let's turn now to the people on the receiving end of all these good ideas, and it has to do something with them in a day-to-day basis in terms of the operating environment. With that, I turn to Ed Bassett. Ed, what's it look like from the receiving end, and how's that changed over the last couple of months?
As we heard from some of the other panelists, it's changing really fast, which is, I say, a good thing, right? The things we heard from Mark, Katie, and Bob that are happening in government, they're all super helpful. These are big accelerators of positive change, and that change is really needed. I think as we look at the state of the art, we'll hear from Chris, I think, about why the threat is being successful. But as a security practitioner who's looking at the state of security of systems that I encounter, it needs some positive change, and I see a lot of that happening because of these initiatives. So what's new since we met in June? As practitioners, our focus has really been on getting people prepared. CMMC being front of mind, a lot of outreach, answering questions on how to navigate CMMC. It's bureaucratically complex a little bit from a company that's trying to get certification. A lot of unanswered questions still. So those questions are being answered kind of on the fly as people are trying to prepare. And I think that process is going pretty well. The big challenge for all of us is to try to reach all corners, right? Make sure that we get to the weakest links, the people who may be struggling the most, don't have access to mature cybersecurity expertise and that sort of thing, advisors that might help them out. We're seeing the larger primes. Katie, I've heard mentioned before that the larger primes, for the most part, have their act together, doing a pretty good job, is the feeling of DoD, and they are taking very seriously, I think, their responsibility to guide and mentor their supply chain. We're involved in some outreach and education, tracking projects where larger primes are trying to make sure they understand where folks are and identify the stragglers. CMMC really highlights, I think, for even those big companies that are doing a great job of their own security, CMMC has really highlighted that they need to maybe do a better job of knowing who their supply chain is down a few layers and understand how that supply chain is doing. So been really excited to work on some of those projects. They have a large impact. I think we're reaching a lot of people with those projects. In terms of the response from the suppliers themselves, the smaller and mid-sized businesses that make up the vast majority of the companies in the DIB, the response has been pretty strong from my perspective. And I mentioned on the last time we got together that my view is somewhat biased, right? The people that are attending our events, the people that are contacting us to purchase services, these are biased towards the early adopters, right? They're not the stragglers that are going to wait until they're going to lose their contract if they don't get certified by tomorrow. So it's a biased audience, but in general, they view the idea of raising the bar as favorable. Now they're trying to figure out, well, how do I do that in a practical way? But that's a really constructive conversation. CMMC is complex. Cybersecurity in a general sense, right? Addressing some of the things that Bob talked about, protecting all these interconnected parts, it's complex. And what we're seeing for smaller companies in particular is they're really needing to kind of retool their thinking about IT, right? So it's not just about taking what they're already doing in IT and overlaying a little bit of security awareness on that. They're having to really rethink how they've built their IT in the first place, and maybe select some new partners that are more closely aligned with cybersecurity as a foundational principle. The ecosystem, CMMC accreditation body, Katie mentioned, put out an ecosystem or announced an ecosystem just around the time of our last panel, just after that, I think, where they're registering and certifying companies and professionals that are aligned with CMMC. That's a huge benefit, because if you are a buyer trying to figure out where to get advice, CMMC appears on a lot of websites, and if you do a Google search, you get a lot of answers back. So being able to select partners that really are well aligned with CMMC, with cybersecurity principles in general, is important. And I keep kind of saying CMMC and cybersecurity in concert, because if you're a member of the Defense Industrial Base, CMMC has, in just a short while, like 6 months, risen to be, it's the standard. It's the flag that needs to be captured, right? So I think people are pegging on that as a North Star and are setting their direction by it, which I think is entirely appropriate. I mean, that's what it was designed to do, I think, is give people a hard metric on how much is good enough. So that lets us then move to the challenge of having the metric be set. We get to move to the challenge of assembling real world solutions that are actually going to work, that are going to meet the standard, obviously get certified, but are affordable to implement, actually usable by the users, effective from a security perspective. All those other things that need to happen besides just passing the audit. That's been our focus. I think it's that we've heard some dissenting voices out there. We've heard some people who say it's too hard, too expensive, too confusing, too fast. You pick it. Whatever argument you want to come up with, I think we've heard it. I'll say that as someone who is trying to take what is coming out on, again, being invented kind of on the fly, we all recognize that, and implement it in the real world. I'll just strongly disagree with those dissenting voices. I think it's, we're working hard to bring to market solutions that make certification affordable and achievable even for really small companies. We're having some success with that. To me, that's somewhat proof in the pudding, right? It seems to be achievable. We haven't obviously taken someone through the certification process yet, so but I have some confidence that that's going to be a rational and an achievable process.
Thank you, Ed.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
It is always nice to have a positive set of comments when we're dealing with an issue that's all too often fraught with negativity, because we do have a lot of reason to be optimistic and to hope here. It just won't be instantaneous. You got to start where you are and get through the middle all the way too. And there actually is no end here.
There's a good bit of work to be done. Yes.
There is a good bit of work to be done, and again, we're generating some additional questions. So thank you all for doing that, and thanks to the audience. Continue to submit your questions. We're on a pace where we're going to have time to answer a number of them. So Chris, you initially laid out some theoretical framework back a little over 2 years ago now on this, and so how does it look now from your perspective in a few short paragraphs?
Sure. It's well, thank you for having me, by the way, and it's an honor to be here again. It's very exciting, actually. As Ed just referred, we view the threat from a counterintelligence perspective and blended operations, which is something that I think is helping to bring what used to be only a cyber perspective together with some of the other dimensions of supply chain, including insider. So it's exciting to me is, in the cyber realm and in basically counterintelligence in general. We've got the standard definition of response being detect, deter, deceive, and neutralize. And I see more and more companies that I'm talking to that because of CMMC and CISO's work and the daily discussions that's going on with Neo and their customers, and multiply that 1,000x, instead of just being in the defensive realm, which is classically deterrence and detection and deterrence, it's starting to edge us closer to what one would call the offensive realm. And that doesn't mean you have to offensively make a cyber attack. A classic model is offensive reaches into that deterrence and then adds deception and neutralization. And you're starting to see, like Tom Bozzart's company, that comes out and not only kind of shields a company from a cyber IT attack, but deceives that entity. And you can go look at that. But that whole ecosystem is building up, which is fantastic to me, because at the end of the day, I argue that we're in this asymmetric era, and the thing that we don't have is comprehensive asymmetric deterrence. So to key off your point, that gives me a lot of hope that I think what CMMC is doing fundamentally is helping companies to understand that their risk that they're carrying has to be monetized. And it's a big ecosystem out there, the defense industrial base. But what Katie has really accomplished, sort of on a theoretical level, but very practically here, is that some of them had to be kind of shown that, right? That the government is not going to do business with you unless you remove some of this risk. And that has kind of led them by the hand into how to monetize that risk. And I've got companies coming to me that are, taking that. Of course, we're going to do that, no question. Level 3, we want to go beyond that. So I'm working right now on helping them build models for how the C-suite and the boardroom can actually monetize that risk. Because at the end of the day, every one of these companies is in business to make money. Money is a finite resource. Risk can be infinite if you're not careful. So how do you, really explain to the board and the CEO, who are not going to be counterintelligence experts, more than likely, who are not going to be cybersecurity experts, more than likely, that, hey, there is an ROI to protecting our brand, to protecting the quality of the products that we deliver, and our ability to gain new clients, including the government and those in the supply chain upstream and downstream from us. So I would just say that, to me, it's very encouraging that so much has happened in the past 2 years since our report came out, and it's starting to gain momentum and steam.
Thanks, Chris. That's a good segue into from the past where your report was into the future here, and I think it's a very interesting set of questions. One of the questions I'll tee up as soon is, you point out the government only wants to do business with people who are taking care of their own risks. As we know, the government in particular has trouble assessing risk from a government's point of view. From a company, monetizing is, in fact, the way you deal with risk, right? With the government, as all too often, and Katie and Bob live in this world on a daily basis, the question of risk really is acceptable or unacceptable, or some gradation of acceptability. That doesn't imply a monetization, and so it makes it's hard to triangulate the way that a company can triangulate. So really the question is, how does the government take advantage of that incentive that companies have to do that? And we'll come back to that during the questions there. Okay. So, Eric, you represent probably a number of the people who are listening and following along on this webinar itself, and others as well. What are your clients thinking, and how are they responding, and what are you advising them to do in a generic fashion, not in a particular client fashion, right, as they deal with this complex universe?
Yeah, I won't mention particular clients here, but usually when there's a large rollout of a new kind of regulatory, what you quote unquote call burden, there's a lot of pushback from industry, and you're not seeing it here. And I think the reason you're not seeing it is that first of all, this is something that a lot of companies should have been doing already, compliance with 800-171. So I think the companies that have been doing things the right way, who have had COI, this is not a big deal to them. They are already compliant, they're ready to go. I've had a number of clients tell me, we're just waiting for the assessment process, we're good to go. And even the smaller contractors that are out there, I think recognize that this is something that we absolutely need to do. I remember speaking at NCMA World Congress about 10 years ago in Nashville, talking about the coming cybersecurity tidal wave that was going to come and requirements that contractors should be getting ready for. And 10 years later, we're getting there. But I think this method that's been developed, this model, has been helpful because it's a gradation based on risk and based on the kind of information the contractors have. It's not a one size fits all. So it allows contractors to kind of take on a level that they think is appropriate for the work they want to do. Now, of course, there's going to be uncertainty in the process as we see right now, and I think a lot of that uncertainty may be solved when the proposed regulation is finally released from OMB. I know DoD worked really quickly to get it to them. That's one observation. Another observation, and I think Katie actually touched on this a little bit earlier, is 889B. My goodness, you talk about a substantial change really quickly. CMMC is more of a gradual change. This thing is hitting like, even though we knew it was kind of coming, it's hitting like a ton of bricks. But it's important to recognize that supply chain is part of CMMC. If you look at levels 2, 3, and 4 in particular, they have specific things that you can relate back to supply chain. And that kind of brings in the 889B requirements. And every contractor will have to should know about already 889B because that's happening in 2 weeks. But if you look at level 4, it requires a development and updated plan for managing supply chain risks associated with the IT supply chain. That's Huawei, that's ZTE, that's Hikvision and those other Chinese companies that were part of the 889B. Even level 3 utilizes, I just took some notes to make sure I said it right, PM9 from NIST 800-53, which requires risk management plans. That arguably would include the Chinese tech. And even level 2 requires compliance with 800-53 risk assessment 5, which is vulnerability scanning, which would, again, if you're scanning systems for that Chinese technology as well. So the CMMC model actually already kind of anticipated 889B and has avenues in there where contractors should consider this larger problem of technology doesn't necessarily play well with DoD and the government as a whole because it can have vulnerabilities and backdoors and things like that. So that's the second thing. One last thing I want to mention, I think Katie touched on it and maybe Ed did and David did, is the fact that while this is a strictly DoD requirement right now, we're already seeing GSA move towards incorporating CMMC in their vehicles because they want to encourage DoD buyers to still use those vehicles. And I wouldn't be surprised if other government-wide vehicles do the same thing pretty soon. So even if you're not in the DoD space right now, you should be aware that CMMC is going to be relevant to you very soon. And even if you don't use these vehicles, I certainly see these civilian agencies picking this up after DoD took the laboring oar. Civilian agencies picking this up and utilizing CMMC for their procurements as well. Thanks, David.
Eric, that's a great segue point for you to end on. Thank you for that. I'm going to take one particular question, which I think we can deal with very quickly, and then go to a broader question that really piggybacks on what you ended up with and what almost everybody else has talked about here. 89B, there was a question came in that says, where do I find the list of the prohibited products which I'm supposed to certify I don't have in my system, right? And the reality is that there is no such list. The closest we come to that list is the Commerce Department list of banned products that comes into there. You can't go to the Huawei website and say, please give me a list of all the things where you have technology embedded or parts embedded, because Huawei, there's no Surgeon General report that they're required to give you a warning of their stuff, right? And this is a challenge for companies. But Eric, you point out, it may be hitting us hard, but we've known this was coming for 2 years. I mean, this was enacted in the National Defense Authorization Act signed by the President on August 13th, 2 years ago. That's why the magic date of August 13th there. And companies do have an affirmative responsibility. Now, keep in mind, even though the Federal Acquisition Regulation does take effect on August 13th, it takes effect for new contracts and task orders being awarded. So unless you're anticipating an award on August 14th, you have more than 2 weeks to get ready, right? And so that comes into play. I want to go back, though, to a comment that Ed made and ask our government folks to comment on that. And Eric, you touched on it a little as well. Ed, you said essentially that CMMC is becoming the standard right? And I know, Katie, that was kind of the intent, right? Let's not have something that's pass-fail. Let's have something that you can grade and you can say you're good enough, you need to be better, you're better enough, right? So if that is evolved to the standard for DoD, and obviously that standard will take years to implement because you got a lot of contracts that it won't come up until that contract is ready for renewal or renegotiation or recompete. To what extent, though, is that the standard in DoD? And then, Bob, for you, how does that standard then translate more broadly into the rest of the federal government? And if not CMMC, what other standards or set of standards do you see coming along in that regard? And then finally, and this is really a question I think for everybody, but Mark, you guys particularly looked at this question. It's more than just the government that needs to be secure, right? I mean, when I do business with somebody, I don't actually ask them whether they're CMMC certified level 3, but I'm kind of hoping that they're at least as secure as I am, if not more so, right? And so how do we deal with that broader universe of security that essentially the national economy requires in order to operate safely? So, Katie, let me start with you, and then Bob, and then Mark.
So, originally when we created the model, it was with an anticipation that any other agency could use it. That's why we put it in the hands of a nonprofit. So that any agency that wanted to utilize it, they had the access. We didn't want the bureaucratic barriers of having to do MOUs and whatnot, so that if an agency felt that this is what they wanted to use in their procurements to protect, they could get access to it. There was a lot into thinking about the model. The other part about the model that we really took a broad view was we understood that the DoD specifically uses NIST 171 for our non-federal systems. But we took into account all of the different cyber standards that are out there and overlaid them into the model so that there would be goodness in it. But we are different. Now, that's one of the things, Bob has spoken about it repeatedly, and Mark, they put it into the Solarium model, right? We have the right to say, this is our standard versus a recommendation of best practices. And there's a fine line you gotta wedge there, right? DOE, Department of Energy, which we overlaid their C2M2 into the model, but they can only recommend people to Department of Energy to get certified, right? So there's a difference in that. I think that for where we sit and the collaboration that we've had, right? I would say the ICT supply chain placemat that CISA has 6 steps, right, in your supply chain, things you should do. First one is define what you want, what the standard is. 2, trust but verify, get a third party to verify it. And I think it's number 5 is validate the verification. So they spoke of a CMMC-like thing, but they can't direct it because they're recommendations of best practices. And I think that, and I'm not trying to put words in anybody's mouth, because the CMMC is what we're doing for DoD. I think there's goodness to be had. I think that there are different things that need to be tweaked on it. If, let's say, healthcare was to use it, there probably would need to be I would say, a component to it, specifically about healthcare, PII and PA, that there's different things, but that process of critical thinking around cybersecurity for business, critical thinking that security is not one size fits all, is paramount to the discussion that we're all having, right? And to the Solarium, I mean, they put it in there. I mean, I'm going to say, God bless you all. That was hugely impactful to me. I read that, we're all people professionals, but I literally, my eyes watered up and welled up, because it's amazing that all of us here that are here today on this webinar and listening and participating on the panel, we care. And, it's not one thing that's going to solve the problem. It's going to be one thing plus another thing plus another thing. And if we don't work in a collaborative environment and say, okay, the goodness that we're learning, I look at what CISA does and what they do every single day as game changers, and how can I absorb that and help my DIB community get that information. That's why I talk about that placemat all the time, and the resources that are there. And I talk about what the Solarium Commission is doing, because it's CMMC is one part of a big solution that we need to get to, but I'll shush there. But I think it only behooves itself that it becomes a standard. You got to trust but verify.
So Bob, what do you take that?
Yeah, I mean, as I hear the question here, Katie talk, right? CMMC in my mind has a number of different elements that's inherent in your question. One is the underpinning sort of standards and controls that are part of being CMMC compliant based on your risk. And as Katie said, you know, those are based on well-established, well-understood NIST work and other similar work that I think we can all endorse as good things to do, right? Depending on your risk judgments. And there's not all kinds of new requirements in terms of how you do the standards. You know, it's there, and this just gives it more oomph. Layering on top of that is, of course, the process that's so key to CMMC of sort of how you go about, you know, the whole cycle of the trust but verify, you know, what level, the process, the auditing, all those sorts of things. And then finally, there's the requirements piece. What is DoD mandating for the DIB? What's going on across the FICs? So when we think about expanding CMMC, you know, first of all, I think it's clear we should all continue to anchor on the kind of things that are in the control area of CMMC. We should look at the process and the ecosystem that are being developed to implement CMMC and see if there are things that can be pulled to do the same thing across the federal spend, across the federal procurement. And then, you know, as we evaluate it, look at the question of, do we need to put more requirements in place that it's actually followed more broadly? You know, at what point should the civilian space think about requirements that are akin to what DoD is putting in place? And that's, I think, where we are, you know, in terms of adoption, more broad adoption of CMMC. I think you're going to see a lot of this happen organically, and then a lot of what Katie was just talking about was the actual industry side, the critical infrastructure side too. A lot of it's going to happen organically, driven through DoD and the DIB, but there may be opportunities and needs for further requirements to be put on via the federal side. You know, the last thing I would say is what I want to make sure, and I think this is important from the industry perspective, is there's not a competitive framework to CMMC. The question is whether you go as far as DoD and the DIB has gone in terms of adoption. But the last thing I want to see in the civilian space is something that looks different than CMMC, that then puts it, you know, burden for compliance across, you know, different frameworks on industry if they want to, depending on whether they're doing business with the Defense Department or doing business with the rest of the civilian government. And I think that would be a huge mistake if there are two different regimes there. And so, you know, one of the key things we want to do is make sure that doesn't happen.
Thanks, Bob. And, you know, very few would accuse Katie Arrington of staying in her lane, because I think you define your lane pretty broadly here, although you stay focused on your mission. And I think
my mission.
DHS is doing the same thing. But Mark, you had the luxury with the commission of really defining your own lanes, right? And it's almost like you're commanding an aircraft carrier. You set your own lane, and everybody else gets out of the way, right? Which really meant you had the responsibility to look more broadly than anybody else on this panel. So how did you wrestle with the question, and where do you think we go with the question of how do we have broader, more applicable standards? And also, how do we evolve those standards as rapidly as the threat changes?
All right, so I think we looked at it as a commission, we looked at it in two different ways. One is kind of those critical function, you know, those sectors or capabilities or industrial units that were critical functions, you know, as kind of CISO would define them. I would say those critical functions we need to have a deep, robust public-private collaboration. And so we took Section 9 of Executive Order 13636 and said, look, you really have to codify this into law and define what the benefits and burdens are. So we said for those people those companies that are part of those critical functions, you know, they would get benefits, whether it's, you know, well, they'd have some burdens first. The burdens is you'd have to meet a security, you know, some kind of security certification. You'd have to participate in specific government programs. Sounds a lot like what the DIB would get at, but this is broader across all the sectors of the economy. And then your benefits would be, and those are two significant burdens, but then your benefits would be improved I&W support, prioritization and federal assistance during a crisis or casualty because you're a critical function, and then probably some kind of liability. I think necessarily some kind of liability protection. So to me, that's the kind of that high level, critical functions get that kind of support. The other things that go with that are like our recommendations on intel support prioritization, trying to influence the national intelligence prioritization framework, participation in a joint collaborative environment. We're passing data back and forth more fluidly or at all between with the private sector and the government. Improvement of the ICC, what used to be the NKIC at CISO, which has gone through some strengthening and weakenings over the last little bit, and participation in the Joint Cyber Planning Office. So that's kind of for the elite. And then what we're getting at, and Katie's mentioned this a bunch, is how do we get that rising tide for everybody, not necessarily those critical functions, but the whole cybersecurity. And that's where our recommendations for a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority. And again, these would be suggested or volunteer, kind of like Underwriter Laboratory or Green Energy. But what we found is if they're valid and they're useful, they become ubiquitous, right? So the idea is you kind of get that certification out there. I think there's some work we could do with the cyber insurance industry with an FFRDC. We had some recommendations there to get them more valuable. So there's kind of two elements here. One is focusing very specific support on those critical functions that drive the U.S. national critical infrastructure, and then support for the overall critical infrastructure, kind of the rising tide of security. And so we're bending those two. That first group is what we're trying to work hardest, because we think obviously getting our critical functions right is the most important. And I love Executive Order 13636, but I got to tell you, executive orders are the wrong way to induce industry's long-term cooperation. I think you need law so they have some protection against the government not carrying through on what they said. And so I think that we're pushing hard. We have a bad acronym called SICI, but systemically important critical infrastructure. But we clearly need to get this codified, benefits and burdens. And so the private sector won't like all of it, but I think long term it's how we make a more robust and secure national critical infrastructure.
Can I add to that real quick, David?
Of course.
I'm sorry. So back when I was in the state of South Carolina, and when we first started talking about this panel today, we talked about critical infrastructure, a cyber response plan. I was on the executive committee that created that for the state of South Carolina after the 2012 breach that we had. And I took that thought process that I went through with that private-public relationship and how critical we need to get to this point. And I've been one of those people, and this is a little bit deviation from, private industry per se for the DIB. But when we're at a cyber war, right, the critical infrastructure is what's going to keep us, above the fray, I would say. And we really need, so in the using the CMMC, right, as one of those drivers, we in the Department of Defense buy about 2% of the energy in the country every year. We're at 2%, which seems really small, but to have one group buy that much is significant. And the fact that we can kind of put the CMMC, because we're buying that capability, we're buying power, just like cyber software as a service, we buy power as a service. We can push that requirement for CMMC out that way versus what the DOE has in a lot of cases where it's only a volunteer program right now. We actually can put it in. So it's giving some, like I've said, DOD is unique because we have a lot of buy in the country. And when we can tweak it to make it successful, to help the majority, there's only a benefit to that. But it's, the CMMC is a start. It's a start. I think that everything that everybody's saying is it's a building block, and we all realize we have to start somewhere, and the CMMC is the start. But yeah, it's that public-private partnership, and I will go back to Bob and to Mark. I've often wondered why at a cyber war, why we don't look at critical infrastructure as the NSS or a part of that. That's one of my bigger, questions, because that's going to be the to defend, to what is it? It's easier to destroy from within.
David, can I add a comment?
I would love that. I was actually going to open it up a little bit here before moving on to a broader set of questions on public-private collaboration. Go ahead.
I think CMMC, obviously brand new, right? Just emerging. But once a company goes through the trouble of getting certified under CMMC, it's a big advantage to them to be able to prove to any of their customers, not just the DoD, that they're doing a good job in cyber. So they can say, hey, look, I have this certification. I met the DoD standard. It's very difficult today to convince clients that you're doing well. You have to fill out questionnaires, answer a bunch of questions, provide a bunch of documents you'd rather not provide. It's a fairly complex and time-consuming process. And having a thing that you can hold up there that's widely recognized and say is I think, going to be viewed as a huge advantage. We've heard this from some companies that have much broader client base than just the DoD. We've heard it from some trade representatives from Canada, where they're not even involved in the Department of Defense, obviously for the U.S. So yeah, it's I think it has probably going to be much more widely accepted and recognized, regardless of whether it's made mandatory by the civil sector and that sort of thing.
That's a good point, Ed. There's a common argument that the government often makes of, we don't want to be in the business of picking winners and losers, right? Because then we're interfering in the marketplace. But the reality is we're making those decisions every day. And we actually do have a vested interest in picking winners, right? And what this helps do is define who is eligible to be those winners. And so I think that comes into play. Before I move on to the next question, Chris, Eric, any comment on that? You're not required. I just want to give you the opportunity. All right, thanks. Nope. All right, thank you. The second aspect of that question, so we covered the standards there, but a number of you highlighted places where the government has to interact with industry, right? In fact, even Mark, you're national director, right? A big question that comes up. So the standards matter to industry because in business, uncertainty is one of your enemies. And the greater certainty you have of what I need to do and how I need to do it in order to be able to win business becomes an essential element of success. And obviously it's in the government's interest as well, because you'll have the companies being able to bid, win, and perform on those contracts, right? But how do you open up that process to collaboration with industry? Starting, I think, Mark, at the national director level, and then Bob, everything you do involves the private sector, and it's not private sector that you control through contracts. It's private sector that you interact with in a collaborative manner. And then Katie, beyond contracts, how do you manage this from the point of view of public-private collaboration? And then this time I will come back to Chris and Eric in terms of what to do with that collaboration. There's a whole host of questions that can be boiled down to that set of themes. So Mark, let me go first with you. How does your national director involved with industry, which is a hard thing to do at the White House?
Yeah, so first, I want to be clear that in the papers we've written on this, we made, CISA is the lead for CISA and the sector-specific agencies, but first among equals, CISA is the lead for this. So, DoD with the DIB, Energy with Department of Energy with Energy, they're the lead for this. What a national person does is, first of all, there will be moments when there's, hard to believe, there's conflicting guidance from different federal agencies. I know that never happens, but that's when the NCD is useful to the private sector. Energy tells him or her one thing, DHS says another. They can come to the NCD and say, look, we're getting this mixed message. And I'll tell you, within sectors, there are sectors with multiple sector-specific agencies responsible for them. So this probably happens more frequently than we know. Now, look, this isn't where you go every time, but it's where you go when you have a significant problem that you can't resolve. So from my perspective, that's the relationship. And the final one, I would say the other one is when we're trying to do something like joint collaborative planning, campaign planning for a problem, and CISA is not getting the traction they need with the private sector, with the senior leadership. And you can imagine that with some of the 4 companies that were testifying yesterday on the Hill. That's when the NCD comes in and brings the power of the White House to at least convene. But I want to be clear, the goal is not to, in any way, to displace CISA or the sector-specific agencies, which include Department of Defense with the DIB, from that role. It's to adjudicate differences, conflicting guidance when on the occasions when that might happen, and to compel cooperation from the larger companies who need who are big enough to be able to wait for the White House to compel them.
All right, that's a good framework. So, Bob, what are you going to do with all this authority and responsibility?
Sure. So I've been enjoying watching some of my former colleagues who are no longer in the government debate the NCD concept and the pros and cons of that. I think a lot of what Mark's saying is that an NCD makes sure that there's an authoritative government position so that whoever's talking to industry is speaking on behalf of an authoritative government position. And I think that's important. At CISA, as you said, we interact regularly in a voluntary framework based on our authorities with critical infrastructure, with industry who, as Katie was just saying, are part of national security. And so, the reason we do that is that I've come to sort of realize in working with the big tech companies and working with the big communications companies, the banks, et cetera, the healthcare companies is, right, they are the source of, they are incentivized to do things to make their businesses secure. They're such a source of innovation. They're such a source of knowledge. And if you can turn on that innovation, that knowledge, some of the incentives they have to put it toward securing their system and helping us be better at national security, that's a great thing that we can take advantage of. And then if you can do it in a way where there's a conversation what can't be done at the industry level, where the gaps are, whether it's getting information about intelligence, whether it's putting different requirements on suppliers, whether it's thinking about things that sit outside the fence line of what's in the company's control, the key interdependencies and things like that. That's what I learned from industry. And what I think we're trying to do is define the delta between what's going to happen without the government involved and the national security need. And my simple theory of government is we come together as an interagency and we take care of that delta if that delta is a national security need. But I don't know what that delta is unless I'm talking regularly with industry.
That's a great point. Thank you, Bob. And Mark, I would note from my perspective historically, all these folks, Bob, you mentioned all of your former colleagues who are out there arguing the wisdom of a national director here. I think that by and large, the government pays more attention to individuals who occupy a statutorily mandated position than they do people who are not. And you have exceptions like that. Katie Arrington is a clear example of that exception where, you have a bigger blade on your bulldozer than anybody else I know, and it's not statutory in nature in terms of the position. It is in terms of the authority, right? But I do think that in general, over the long run, having an institutional structure does matter in an internal bureaucracy, and it always will. And so I think that's a useful element to come into play. So Katie, yours on the public-private collaboration, and then I'll ask Chris and Eric for comments on that as well.
So I'm the CMMC is a public-private collaboration. I mean, that's exactly what it is. We didn't create the model in a bubble by ourselves. We went out to academia and industry and said, what are the best practices? The way we have to function in the future is in these private-public partnerships to create solutions that we can all absorb. In the Internet of Things, and the one thing that I've spoken about it, I know Bob's spoken about it, Mark has, Chris has, Ed has, and David and Eric, you both have. Cyber is the one thing that connects us all, and we all have a vested stake in cyber. Period. I mean, there's nothing in the whole COVID pandemic. And when we look back, I think our children's children, as we look back at the Great Depression, I think we'll look back at this pandemic, and it brought out an awareness, right, of the supply chain and the interconnectivity of it, and that it's going to take all of us to work together to solve that problem. B, how interconnected we are through the Internet of Things. And I'll go back to, to strengthen our education system. It's got to be a public-private partnership to get that done, as we have, entire states that are going to use the option to use virtual education. As telehealth expands, and thankfully it is expanding, we all are going to be interconnected on that. And we all have to have a vested stake in that. So I think that this is the starting of a new chapter in the way we do things going forward. And I don't see it being successful without being a public-private partnership.
All right. Eric, Chris, comments?
Sure.
Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'll jump on a few things. One is, yeah, so I totally agree with everything that's been said. Katie really summarized it well. I'll just jump back to the monetization piece. FBI Director Wray recently said that the FBI is opening a new Chinese counterintelligence investigation every 10 hours. That's a stunning number. I couldn't believe it when he said it. And that obviously is not just directed at the DIB. If you look at, what's going on with the escalation of the economic warfare between China and the United States alone, and what's recently happened with their consulate in Texas, and how that's infiltrating into oncology and medicine, this is systemic. And as Katie said, I think we talked about this last time around. COVID, if anything, really illuminated and brought the term supply chain security into the living room of most Americans that are listening. And that's a huge push forward. So to me, public-private is coming down, no longer, stick and carrot. I think it's coming down to, and I'll get to that question you asked earlier, you hinted that was coming in, sort of, well, how does it, the government doesn't monetize for money and the private sector is, I argue that, look, at the end of the day, we're talking about unknown risk. For the government, that to me boils down to operational risk to execute the mission. Whether that mission is in critical infrastructure, delivering information, energy, power, anything, or a weapon system, or our ability to defend ourselves. On the private sector side, that same level of monetization, coupled to that risk that the government wants to buy down, is tied directly to their brand and the value of that brand today and the value of that brand in the future. So there's common ground. Those entities, whether they're talking to the government in terms of the Department of Defense or CISA or other entities in terms of national security, the medical industry probably 5 years ago had no idea that they were in China's sights. And now it's like in their face. So there's common ground there, although one is monetizing to defend the United States and our interests, and the other is primarily, first and foremost, and they're good patriots, but they have a duty to address their shareholder concerns. That's good common ground. So I think we're moving forward very nicely on that. I would argue that I'm in a few workshops that we're putting on privately within government and private sector, and I think one of the things that we could look at is when there is a breach, when there is an attack, really looking at models for getting all the stakeholders to sit down, right? Because there's multiple agencies in the government that are stakeholders. And in some of these tabletop exercises and workshops, we've got CEOs of small companies. Again, they are not security experts. They're like, they don't get the bigger picture. And I think that's really the next incentive that we're going to have is how do we do a better job of educating everybody and beginning a dialogue so that stakeholders sitting around the table, whether one is acquisition, one is RD&E, another is maybe the operational user. If it's a defense system, it's CISA. If it's the vector to come in was from another direction. And I think we're going to start experimenting. I think we'll start to see experimentation with new ways of having that dialogue.
Can I add to that, Chris? Amazing point, what you just said. And for everybody listening, we need to change the culture that exfil or breach is a 4-letter word that we don't want to discuss, and make it something that we say, okay, how do we defend ourselves so that we don't have this happen to us again? And that is a cultural change that we have to have as a paramount, that we have to be able to share what has happened to us without fear of the negativity associated with it, because your brand is brand awareness and brand protection is important, but environments where we can come in and really share what threat looks like in a environment of, okay, we were doing all of these things together collaboratively to buy down the risk, and this happened. So if it happened to me, the likelihood it's going to happen to you, and let's work on a solution set. So great point. That just went 4-letter word. That's what it needs not to be.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Chris, your comment about being surprised at one new case every 10 hours. My reaction to that was they're probably missing quite a few if that's the only pace they're doing, because there's probably more than that happening. And I would note I was actually on a tabletop exercise a little while back with a number of private sector companies who have nothing to do with the government, right? They just make stuff and sell it on the commercial market. And one of the CEOs astonished me when he says, "Why do I care if China's inside my network as long as they're not interfering with my business?" Right. That education is really, we may need more education than we think here, right? If that's the reaction of a person who, based on that person's background and experience prior to that company, really should have known better than to make a statement like that. So, Eric, any final comment before I drill down in a couple of last-minute questions here?
Just a couple of things. One, picking up on the thread that Katie and Chris were discussing, I think having protections in place for those companies, so to encourage them to share, there is a DFARS clause which requires third-party contractors who are reviewing things to sign NDAs and things like that. I think that's important to encourage industry to share, because like Katie and Chris said, their name is very important. And if it's across all the newspapers that they've been subject to a breach because they disclose something to DoD, that's not going to encourage sharing that information and allow, because it's a lot of times it's just bad luck, right? They have the right protections in place, but it could have been one of any 10 companies, but taking those lessons learned and applying them across industry will be very helpful to prevent that next attack. And I think from a larger perspective, just changing a culture a little bit. I know this is kind of a kumbaya thing, but we're all in this together, industry and government, and encouraging industry and government to work together. I think far too often, and maybe it's because of what I do for a living, but far too often people get in their adversarial corners and look at each other as maybe not the enemy, but adversaries sometimes. And looking at the industry as a collaborative environment where we're just trying to accomplish these goals together, I think would be helpful. And I think we've gotten somewhere, down the road a little bit. Organizations like National Contract Management Association encourages industry and government to work together and things like that. And I just want to pick up on one last thing, David, that you mentioned that somebody asked, where can I find a list of these Chinese products and services? I think the better way to maybe look at it is a list of the companies, because even though it's limited to certain services and products provided by these companies, that's pretty much all they do. And the definitions in the B clause are broad enough that it would really be any product or service provided by these companies. So I think we need to look, and I think you appropriately said, look at that commerce list, because I think that's a great place to start. But look at the name of the companies instead of the names of the products and services that they offer.
That's a good point, Eric. I would note, of course, their affiliates and subsidiaries list is not always as easily discernible as the ones with their name in it. It's a tough thing.
Absolutely.
We have a series of questions here that I'm going to focus on. Ed and Katie, you guys have been getting away largely scot-free up to now with this, but a whole host of questions from companies who say, okay, I get all this, but what do I do and how do I do it, right? And so ranging from how do I find out what's a prohibited product, or equally importantly, how do I find out what is a substitute for that prohibited product that I can get that's not a prohibited product, right? And there is no such list for that, although I'm sure people are peddling those lists out on the internet every day. But particularly as we focus on implementation of CMMC, the questions are along the lines of, okay, and I'll just summarize them quickly. 270,000 companies are going to have to do this, but how soon, and how do I know how soon for me, right? Particularly if I'm a subcontractor. Where do I turn to find advice and help on how to get this? And Ed, as you know, you see ads every day coming in on this. Katie, you see these ads every day. We can help you. We can do this work for you. I think some of you even alluded to folks who are opposed to it and yet still trying to make a profit off of it, right? Which is that's the American way. Okay, but it's a serious matter for companies, particularly smaller companies. Where do I turn? How do I know what to do? Another another example. A contracting officer is going to need to have my certification before they can award the contract. Isn't that going to move the contracting officer to say, I'm only going to look at people who I know already have a certificate rather than do that? So how do you reassure folks that this system is going to play out fairly for everybody who wants to comply and move forward with it? So Katie first, and then Ed, how does it look from your perspective?
So one of the things that we've done with the CMMC, the AB, and how the license actually will be registered, we're doing that, taking that into EMAS within the DoD. Some people, that you may know the old EMAS, new EMAS, completely different. So as soon as your company is given the license number, we're going to populate SAMs, we're going to populate SPURS, we're going to populate GSA. So it'll be instantaneous throughout the whole of the Department of Defense ecosystem, because we're going to lessen the burden on industry. The contracting officers at the time of award, once you submit in a RFP, we're going to ensure that you have the right assessors in your geographical area, or we won't release the RFP with that CMMC in it, right? We're really doing this strategically. I don't want people to panic, but if you have work that is going to come up for it's either going to a recompete in the next 12 months, or you're looking as the pipeline, your business development pipeline is looking at, work that is emerging capability, start to position yourself on what is it I want to do in that work, and how do I fit? You go to the CMMC AB website to find the people that are certified to get you assessed. That's where you go. If you have questions about what it is you think that you may or may not do, you go to the CMMC DoD website and you look at the model and you walk yourself through. If I'm already have this DFAR clause in, the 7012 DFAR clause, I need to look at level 3 and I need to map and see where I am on that and start getting yourself together. Those two areas are going to be key, but know that as soon as that we are allowed through the rule change to make you aware of these are the work that we're looking at, but know that and I don't want people to panic, right? Level 1 is the vast majority of what is out there today. If it takes longer than a half a day to get you a CMMC level 1 certification from the approved assessor, we've missed the mark. 17 no-cost controls, virtually, except for your antivirus software, that you could be doing right now today to prep yourself. And a lot of the companies, the larges, that are in the ecosystem of the DoD use tools in their supply chain when they register them that are doing the CMMC now. Like they're putting in those type of controls right now. So there's a lot you can do, but the two sources, the AB body website and my website, are the only two that I would look at right now.
Got it. Thank you, Katie. Ed, we got a minute left, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
I'll keep it short. In terms of, is it fair, right? It's certainly fair. Anybody can get certified. This is not an exclusive club that is somehow hard to get into. I agree with Katie that level 1 is essentially trivial and people should be able to do it. So let's look at the higher levels, right? Those levels are not trivial and there's some work involved, and you need to make sure that you really aligned your solutions with the requirements that you're looking at what's actually being asked and aligning that there. There's companies out there that are specializing in this. They're building economies of specialization, and that's the idea. I think if every company tries to do this on their own, very challenging, right? Go to where the specialists are.
So Dave Gardy, I'm going to turn back to you. Usually I like to close out by giving folks a little comment, but I think I'm going to close out by saying it may be that you're going to have us back again for round 3.
Thank you, everyone. Excellent program today. Again, this is What is the Future of Government Cybersecurity Risk in the Supply Chain, Part 2. And we do have downloadable files for the Delivered Uncompromised Report and the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission Report. We'll have the archive up within sooner than 24 hours. I'm Dave Gardy for Cybersecurity TV Solutions and for NeoSystems, thank you for joining us.